Right now, the Russian economy is collapsing in a way that it hasn't since the early 1990s, the time the fall of the Soviet Union happened and the planned economy disintegrated. And that is forcing Putin, I think, in a relatively short time frame to the negotiating table. So let's not forget, he screwed this up. And his Chinese friends in Beijing must be looking in disbelief.
Again, I have a lot of respect for Ferguson. I think he's clearly extremely smart. He has a lot of interesting views that I think are very much worthy of consideration. His books are quite excellent. I've read a couple of them. And however, this view here, I feel like is probably significantly biased. I hope he's right? I hope the sanctions are having that effect that he said here, that and Putin is going to have to come to the negotiating table quite early because of how devastating these sanctions have been. I hope that's true. I hope that's true. Unfortunately, as far as I can tell, it's unlikely for that to be the case. The much more likely conclusion to all this, or at least the next step here, is that Putin/Russia end up wrecking Ukrainian cities like they did with Grozny and Aleppo and such. So again, hopefully I'm wrong, but I think Ferguson's view is unfortunately too optimistic.
Neil, thank you so much again for giving us of your time, and your views as an economic historian are critically important in my view at the moment. It seems to me that channeling Dickens, in some ways, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. The worst is obviously utterly dreadful. But the bravery of the Ukrainians, from its leader down, is really inspirational and will have, I think, global and long-term effects. You went there often, I think.
Another thing too, emphasizing the bravery of the Ukrainian people, obviously it's true. At the same time, this is probably making it so that our analysis is much more emotional than it should be, and much less grounded in reality than it should be. Being guided by sentimentality, emotionality, positive emotion or negative emotion for that matter, is unlikely to result in sound analysis, right? So I think that might be playing a role here as well in all likelihood overly optimistic view from Ferguson, then it seems likely from Anderson as well.
And I think the United States' leadership, despite the promises of Joe Biden when he was elected, has been woefully inadequate, not only in this crisis, but really since the administration came to power. Think about what happened last year. The Biden administration slowed arms deliveries to Ukraine, lifted the sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline designed to bypass Ukraine so that Russian gas could go directly to Germany, and signaled that it wouldn't fight if Putin invaded. It would only use sanctions. And they gambled quite wrongly that sanctions would deter Putin. Well, I think that was a fundamental misjudgment.
I don't think that was the gamble. It was trying, again, to avert a possible world war. Again, we could have a debate about strategic ambiguity. I think that's a legitimate debate, and I don't have a strong conclusion there. It's difficult to say what would have been optimal. If we could run multiple simulations of reality, then that would be great. We'd be able to figure this out, but we can't. So it's very difficult to know. But the reason, as far as I can tell, the reason why the Biden administration took that line was because they wanted to make it absolutely clear that we are not starting World War III, and we'll do economic things, we'll do other things besides putting boots on the ground, but we are not putting boots on the ground because we absolutely need to make sure that World War III is off the table. If we have anything, if we have any choice in the matter, right? So. As far as I can tell, that was at the very least a reasonable move. Whether or not it was optimal is hard to say, but I don't think the move to employ economic sanctions was made primarily as like a full stop deterrent. If it didn't properly deter, then so be it. The point is that there was no other move available besides escalation into a world war, and that clearly was off the table and should have been off the table.
Well, I think that was a fundamental misjudgment, and it's led us to the biggest foreign policy crisis in Europe, I think, since the end of World War II, because this is a much more dangerous situation than, say, 1956 or 1968, precisely because there is a real risk the war could escalate.
Again, it's difficult for me to know with certainty, but it seems quite likely to me that Ferguson is significantly biased on this topic. I mean, the first thing was about NATO expansion when the U.S. promised Ukraine inclusion in NATO in 2008, and his view, apparently Ferguson's view, is that what we should have done was, after the promise, fulfill the promise. Whereas, I think the much more coherent view and the stronger view is the Mearsheimer view, which is that we shouldn't have promised Ukraine NATO membership in the first place. We should have probably never expanded NATO eastward at all, but certainly not. We shouldn't have promised NATO expansion to Ukraine. That was insane. Anyway, we talked about this before. Like, if you're not familiar with that view, I would suggest looking up a John Mearsheimer video on this topic. He's quite cogent on this, in my opinion. So I think that's an example of the kind of bias that I'm talking about. As far as I can tell, Ferguson is wrong on that topic. And then similarly here with the Biden administration, as far as I can tell, the Biden administration has done everything they possibly could with this shitty hand. There's so many poker analogies in this sort of situation, so I apologize for that. But what else could the Biden administration really have done? The only other plausible move, I think, is to have used strategic ambiguity when in the run-up to Russia's invasion, and maybe that would have deterred Russia. That's possible. But it's also possible that it wouldn't have done anything, and it may have just made the situation more dangerous. Dmitri Alperovitch, who I've referred to before, and as far as I can tell, has been the most accurate in his predictions on this crisis. He is the founder of CrowdStrike, which is like a cybersecurity firm, I believe. And he seems to be extremely knowledgeable on this topic, and again, his predictions, as far as I can tell, have been the best around. He was asked, if I remember correctly, on the Hidden Forces podcast whether or not it would have been good for Biden to say that the U.S. would defend Ukraine against Russia, or put in any sort of strategic ambiguity there. And Alperovitch, if I remember correctly, was quite clear. He thought that no, that would not have been a good move. That would have just made essentially Putin even more angry, because the main reason, like one of the main reasons that he wanted to do the invasion in the first place is because he didn't want Ukraine to be in the arms of the West, basically, right? And so to have this kind of clear statement of Ukraine being in the arms of the West would have just infuriated Putin even further, and motivated him even further to escalate things and to invade. And perhaps he would have been even more destructive rather than going in with anyway. It's hard to say exactly what would have happened there, but it's possible that things would have been even worse. And at the very least, Alperovitch thinks that any sort of promise from the U.S. to say they would have defended Ukraine against Russia would not have worked. And again, it's difficult to say. It's difficult to get in the head of Putin, but I think if there is one person to believe on that subject, it is Alperovitch, considering that he has been the most successful in predicting this series of events so far.
If we can dwell on this for a moment, the very thing that you've just alluded to, we've misread Putin time and time again, and he has used the few cards he has with enormous effect, including rattling the nuclear saber, so that now we have a situation where the world's bravest and most admired man is saying, protect our skies. It's obvious that there are people in NATO, including in Britain, who think that perhaps that should happen. Poland's offered it's a fairly small fleet of Soviet-era fighters, and the Americans are saying no, presumably because of the threat of the nuclear retaliation by Putin. This bloke seems to be able to get away with an extraordinary amount. I'm not saying whether I think it's right or not to try and protect those skies, but I am saying it looks very much like a capitulation to another threat.
Well, I think that this is a bluff on the part of...
I don't know. It's as if everyone just looks at any sort of possible like war situation as World War II again and again and again and again. It's always a peace. If you do anything to try to de-escalate, then you're automatically an appeaser, and you know what what that means, right? So it's just that seems like, I mean, there's so many problems with that. Like one is that obviously sample size of one. I mean, are you fucking kidding me? Like you're going to extrapolate from this and say that that's what our model should be if we're in this sort of situation forever? That's not scientific whatsoever and is completely illogical. Like it seems quite likely that Hitler was, a pretty unique historical character, right? And even the appeasing thing is more complicated. My understanding is that Neville Chamberlain, while there was appeasement that happened, he was also trying to buy time to make it so that Britain could increase its military force. So even that's complicated. Another thing is, instead of using this kind of overly emotional language of like, appeasing like this bloke seems to be able to get away with an extraordinary amount, like as if it's some like you're making like I'm struggling to put this into words, but it's like this is not looking at it in a strategic game theoretical lens, right? This is not doing an expected value calculation to try to determine what is going to be the optimal strategy considering all the risks involved, right? That's not the kind of language that's being used here. Instead, it's like reputational. It's coming from the perspective of being slighted, right? Something along those lines. That is not the viewpoint that we should be using here, okay? But for God's sake, we're talking about fucking nuclear war. We're talking about goddamn nukes, okay? Push your ego to the side. Put this kind of I wish I had a better word for this. I can't think of the word for this sort of thinking. It's like vendetta culture or like honor culture. Like maybe that's a decent phrasing. So it's almost like we're operating in some sort of honor culture lens here, where obviously that's an idiotic way to view this. Like, who cares about your fucking honor? Who cares about what he's able to get away with or not? The point is we're trying to minimize the chances of a nuclear holocaust. Okay, that's clearly like the most important piece here. So using this sort of language, using this sort of lens is completely wrong-headed and coming at it from the exact wrong perspective. Again, I continue to be befuddled how otherwise smart people have their brains just jump out the window as soon as something like this occurs. It becomes a dick measuring contest, rather than looking at this as bluntly and plainly and logically as you possibly can. I mean, this is not, this is not a schoolyard fight. This is not some family feud. Okay, we're talking about really grave stakes. We need to be very serious about this.
Ordinary amount. I'm not saying whether I think it's right or not to try and protect those skies, but I am saying it looks very much like a capitulation to another threat.
Well, I think that this is a bluff on the part of a man who is badly miscalculated. Putin thought that this would be a walkover and that the Ukrainians would fold, rather like the Afghan government army folded last year. He even had the editorial ready to run that would appear following the collapse of Kyiv and the fall of the Zelensky government. None of this has happened. Even although they have significant superiority, especially in the air, the Russians have sustained astonishingly heavy casualties. The Ukrainian defenders have fought heroically and effectively. And so this has gone wrong for Putin. What's also gone wrong for him is that he underestimated the pain the sanctions would inflict, not seeing that there might be, in addition to government-mandated sanctions, spontaneous private sector sanctions directed by Western corporations against Russia. Right now, the Russian economy is collapsing in a way that it hasn't since the early 1990s, the time the fall of the Soviet Union happened and the planned economy disintegrated. And that is forcing Putin, I think, in a relatively short time frame to the negotiating table. So let's not forget, he screwed this up. And his Chinese friends in Beijing must be looking in disbelief at the fiasco that has resulted from an invasion that they gave the green light to around about the eve of the Beijing Olympics. I think that the threat to use nuclear weapons was a bluff, but unfortunately it worked. I think, on the other hand, that we were right not to discuss a no-fly zone, because that would have involved a NATO.
Again, on the nuclear weapons thing, perhaps it was a bluff. We don't know. That's probably the main point to make there, though. That many of these analysts, and again, Ferguson is a first-rate mind, so I'm just confused that he's making these sorts of errors. They're engaging in mind reading. It's as if they know with certainty that it was a bluff. Like, how could you possibly know this? I mean, that would necessitate you getting, essentially, literally getting into the mind of Putin. Do you have access to mind reading capabilities? I wasn't aware that this was possible. Please tell me about this, so that I can figure out what's going on in my dog's brain. I always wonder what's going on in his cute little skull. But anyway, hopefully you see what I'm getting at here. It's possible that it was a bluff, but we have no idea. And to posit as if we do know with certainty, especially considering the possible ramifications of this, it boggles the mind. I get so confused and upset by this, because it's not just it's not just some stupid thing that is going to blow over, or it probably in all likelihood isn't existential, like wokeism or whatever. Wokeism often, like the logic there is completely idiotic, but usually, not always, but usually the ramifications are relatively mild. Certainly nothing along the lines of nuclear war. Here, the ramifications are, as dire as they can be. And yet people continue to make these sorts of logical and reasoning mistakes where they assume things that they have no reason to assume.
Olympics. I don't think that the Russian invasion, the Russian offensive can last much longer. I think it may even be measurable in days, maybe weeks, certainly not months. The economic situation in Russia is absolutely dire. And from my understanding, this has finally penetrated the palatial residences that President Putin occupies. I have good reason to think that the Russians are ready to take a peace deal that would give them Crimea, Donetsk and Luhansk, in other words, what they already de facto controlled, as long as Ukraine commits not to joining NATO. And my understanding is that President Zelensky will make that commitment in order to bring peace to his country and stop the killing. So my sense is that we are...
Okay, again, that would be very good if that were to happen, obviously. I do wonder why he says, I have a good reason to think that when, as far as I can tell, the Russians have been very clear about what their demands have been. No NATO, Ukraine, no NATO, no EU. They get Crimea, independence of Donetsk and Luhansk. And then the last thing was like demilitarization or whatever, but that's been kind of muddied, like what exactly that means. So I'm a little bit confused when he's saying, like, I have good reason to think that the Russians are ready to take that sort of deal, when that was what they were demanding the entire time. So it seems clear that they were ready to take that sort of deal because that's what they were demanding. So that's confusing. Maybe he has some inside information, though, when it comes to Ukraine, because I think that's been the more unclear part. Like what is Ukraine willing to give up? What are they willing? What kind of deal are they willing to make? Because so far, we haven't had like super strong indications on them budging significantly, with the exception today of Zelensky saying very clearly that Ukraine is not part of NATO and will not be part of NATO. So there's an update there, it seems. So I don't know, maybe he has some insider information when it comes to Ukraine. I'm not sure if the insider information is useful at all when it comes to Russia, because that information was already public.
Palatial residences that President Putin occupies. And even with their own readiness to bomb Ukraine back to the Stone Age, or at least back to the 1940s, Russia cannot win this war and is going to have to negotiate a compromise.
Switching to the impact on the West, we've come out of, I would say, years of mismatch.
We said this already, but I just want to emphasize, I really hope he's right about that. I really hope he's right that a deal is going to be negotiated relatively soon. That would be very good. Perhaps I should update my model, my current probability estimates in light of that, because right now I have it as the most likely scenario being like no negotiation, no negotiated peace deal anytime soon, and Ukrainian cities being turned into rubble, basically. So maybe we'll make that a little bit less certain. I don't know how seriously to take his sources or whatever, but maybe we'll update slightly downward on the most likely scenario being that Ukrainian cities are turned into rubble, and that eventually they negotiate a kind of peace deal instead of before. So we'll take that down from 60% to like 55. Let's just say 55. Hopefully he's right.
Switching to the impact on the West, it's all obviously very concerning and will require enormously strong leadership. And I think the world's eyes are very much on America at the moment. How things unfold there will be interesting. Tell me, in the West, we've seen, really in the name of climate responses, all sorts of policies being pursued, which in effect push our manufacturing and other capacities towards the authoritarian regimes. That's effectively what they do. The heart of this question goes to the thing that's on my mind here is, will we be sensible enough to recognise that security must come before climate, in my view, for this reason? If you're a climate change activist, you ought to be recognising the blunt reality that the authoritarian regimes are not committed to climate. You break the liberal rules-based global order under which, if you like, we slowly recognise the importance of climate.
I see what he's saying, and I probably agree. But I just want to note that climate is a security issue as well. Let's not get too crazy with the possible scenarios, but in a worst case scenario, there could be war ramifications from climate, like wars over water and such. People talk about this. Again, obviously this is pretty speculative, so it's hard to say what will happen for sure, but that seems plausible. So from that perspective, there's a kind of security concern when it comes to climate. Probably also similarly with rising sea levels and just general terrible living conditions being not good for the security of a nation, especially if it's defined as the well-being and livelihoods of the people within that nation, which I think is a decent definition of security. So anyway, the point is just in general, I don't think you can cleanly separate security and climate if you're being technical about it. However, if you're just being like relatively loose with the terms, and you're talking about like kind of military defense as security versus climate policy, just talking about like energy policy and related issues, then I guess we can separate it that way. That's fine. I just wanted to make the point that if you're being technical, it's not so separatable, I think.
So this should force everybody to rethink their energy strategy on both sides of the Atlantic and indeed around the world. And as you say, while we're doing that, don't hold your breath expecting China significantly to reduce its coal consumption. It's China that is, of course, driving climate change at the moment, and nothing that we do really makes a great deal of difference if China continues to increase coal consumption in the way that it has every year since Greta Thunberg was born in 2003.
Well, that's a good segue into my final lap in this.
He's definitely said that line before. It's a little too practiced. Okay, you just happen to know the dates there. Like, okay, all right.
Deal of difference if China.
I mean, it's a good line. It's a good
continues to increase coal consumption in the way that it has every year since Greta Thunberg was born in 2003.
Well, that's a good segue into.
And I do sense that we should all be very clear-sighted about the role that China has played in this crisis in enabling Vladimir Putin's war of aggression.
Neil, the civilized world owes you a great debt. Thank you very much for your time and for the role that you're playing in help.
It's a controversial term, but whatever. I don't give a fuck about word games, basically. Yeah, so let's just leave it at that. Let's finish. Here's outro, and then we'll probably comment a little.
Neil, the civilized world owes you a great debt. Thank you very much for your time and for the role that you're playing in helping us understand right across the three worlds, as I touched on, what's happening and what's at stake. Thank you.
Thanks, John. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you.
Great. That was interesting, but yeah, I think I have significant disagreements with Ferguson's view here, and it seems like Anderson's view as well. I don't know. It's always with these conservatives. They're always so hawkish. I don't really understand it. Look, but can we put our political ideologies aside? Can we put like dick measuring contests aside? Can we put our pride aside and just look at what's actually going to work for maintaining peace and making sure that humans don't destroy ourselves? Like, you know, guys, hello, please. Like let's, you know, please. So yeah, I don't know. I don't really have it. I went through some of the details of why I disagreed with Ferguson's view already in the middle of the video, so let's not rehash that. But it still just confuses me how the debate is so overall, you know, poor and wrong-headed and overly emotional. You know, it's just like, if we're being serious about policy analysis, like a significant portion of the conversation should not be about how much you admire Zelensky. You know, like that's obviously, you know, you're clearly coming from it with the wrong frame of mind. You know, it should not be like, okay, we love this guy, he's amazing, we need to do everything we can in order to back him because he's just, you know, his dick is so big or whatever the fuck. Okay, like I know I'm being like crude about this, but that's kind of the mode that they're doing this analysis from, or like Anderson was setting it up with, and that's just stupid. You're not going to be able to get to the conclusions that are necessary, because often, especially in such a difficult situation like this, the conclusions are not going to make you feel good. You know, it's going to suck. If you actually want to know what's true and what we should do in this sort of situation where there's essentially no winning, and moralizing and such doesn't get you anywhere, you're not going to be able to get to an answer that is actually useful. You know, you're just going to be blinded by your own moral righteousness and sentimentality. You see, this is why, you know, I don't agree with Mearsheimer on everything, but I think his general framework is the correct one. You know, like, put the sentimentality aside. Just look at what's actually happening in reality. and what we can actually do in reality. And we should be operating from that sort of frame if we actually want to mitigate the possibility of war and decrease the amount of human suffering that exists.